September 1986. Alan Ayckbourn's Women in Mind premiered in London. Martina Navratilova won her third US singles title. And Patrick Duffy returned to the TV show Dallas. His death attributed to his wife Pam's bad dream, which erased all of last season. A bad dream for this TV series, but there were plenty of good dreams to come for the next season of Thomas and Friends, as this premiered on the 24th of September, 1986. This is the story of Thomas the Tank Engine and Friends, Season 2. Looking back now at the franchise as a whole, you would think that Thomas was a smash hit success. And while it was received very well, it wasn't necessarily the runaway hit that everybody was hoping for. It had great responses and done very well in video sales, but with the success of Season 1 came more pressure when it came to Season 2. It started off with them getting a much bigger set, with the crew finally moving to Shepperton Studios, which would be their home base for the entirety of the model era. With more space came more opportunities to world build. As David Mitton and Robert Cardona both returned as director and producer respectively, they had more chance to flex their muscles, expanding the world of Sodor, building new sets that we hadn't had a chance to see in Season 1, and more opportunities to introduce a darker, more real-life setting for the Island of Sodor. There was one slight problem. As this was called Thomas the Tank Engine and Friends, we needed episodes that focused on the main character of Thomas. But the Railway series material had shockingly little Thomas in it. It was called the Railway series books for a reason. There was a vast array of characters and not a singular protagonist. For marketability, Brett Allcroft had made Thomas the lead character of the show, a character that the audience could identify with and relate to on their journey. At this point, they were still only allowed to use material that was written by either Wilbur Awdry or his son Christopher. So a unique compromise was made. At the time, Christopher Awdry had taken up the mantle of his father and continued on with the Railway series books, and was commissioned to write another book which had stories that could be adapted straight into Season 2. This book was called More About Thomas the Tank Engine. I know, not an inventive title. When you're pushed for a deadline, I think you can let it slide. 3 out of the 4 stories from this book were adapted for this season, which had a focus on Thomas. The episode Thomas and Trevor was adapted from a one-off story which was written by Christopher Awdry, and Thomas and the Missing Christmas Tree was specially written by Christopher Awdry as well. So now there was enough Thomas-centric stories to get around the corner they had managed to box themselves into. There was also more problems behind the scenes when it came to episodes themselves, as some episodes were meant to be adapted for this season but never materialised. The most famous being The Missing Coach. This was originally meant to be the introduction of Donald and Douglas's characters, but due to Allcroft thinking that the story would be too complicated for children to understand, it was dropped in the 11th hour. I'm not going to go into the full details of this because I have actually recorded a video breaking down this Missing Coach episode. So if you want more details, the link will be in the description of this video. Other episodes that were meant to be adapted include Gordon Goes Foreign, which was scrapped because production costs would have been too high, Percy's Promise, and Double Header, although they would get their spotlights in the following season. As I just stated, Season 2 was expected to go bigger, and it certainly did so with the cast of characters. The Railway series is known for its vast characters, and we got 10 more introduced in Season 2. The characters introduced, in order of appearance, were Trevor the Traction Engine, Duck the Great Western Engine, Harold the Helicopter, Bill and Ben the Tank Engine Twins, as they made their debut in Percy Takes the Plunge, Devious Diesel, the Diesel Engine, our Caledonian classics, Donald and Douglas, Daisy the Diesel Railcar, finally, Poco, the Metropolitan Vickers Diesel Electric Type 2. These are characters that became very much beloved in the following seasons of Thomas and Friends in every iteration that was presented. This is one of the reasons why Season 2 is so beloved, as secondary characters that were introduced in this season became fan favourites from here on out. Some got better treatment than others, with Boko in particular getting the raw end of the deal. But overall, this was a milestone season for Thomas and Friends. Seasons 1 and 2 would be the vehicles to try and drive this show into the American markets, and in turn, more international audiences. If these 2 seasons didn't live up to expectations, we may not have the franchise as we know it now. And it may just have been a 2-season UK exclusive show similar in the vein of Tugs. I've made my thoughts very, very clear on season 2. I love it. It is my favourite season. It is my nostalgia bait season. It is the season that I watch constantly, whether I need to pick me up if I've had a bad day, or if I just want to unwind with some really great storytelling. This is the season that I always gravitate to. As I've said in previous videos, I was born in 1987, 1 year after this had came out. Season 2 and Season 1 were my bread and butter when it came to Thomas and Friends. But Season 2 was the one that was constantly played on terrestrial TV at the time. It was the most recent, the most prominent, and the one that I spent my early years binge watching before binge watching became a thing. I loved the characters. I loved the stories. I loved the world building. I loved the darker, more industrial settings. All of it was fantastic. This was where the crew could really go for it. Because while a lot of things stayed the same, Ringo Starr returning as narrator, the production team staying the same, there were so many differences on screen that you would have thought it was a complete revamp. Because essentially it was. They had more space and more money to go big or go home. And they went big. And they hit a monumental home run. I could wax lyrical about my love of Season 2. I have done before. But I think if I went into every little nitpick about why I love the season, we would be here for a very, very long time. And with the previous video clocking in at almost an hour, it might be wise that I scale things back a little bit. So I'm going to cut it off there with my thoughts, and we're going to jump right in to my ranking of all 26 episodes. Once again, these are all my own personal opinions. Your list will be different from mine, and it is the one thing that makes the Thomas fandom so unique. Please let me know in the comments what your thoughts are on Season 2, and how you would rank this season. All I ask is that you be respectful, and above all, enjoy the video. Okay, let's dive in. Number 26, Thomas, Percy and the Coal. Thomas and Percy quarrel about proper colours for an engine, but both engines end up getting in trouble with coal. If you watch my top 10 worst episodes list of Season 2, I think I was a bit too harsh on these episodes. It doesn't mean that there aren't flaws, because there are, but I want to clarify, like with Season 1, I do not hate any of these episodes. I would much rather take a mid-Season 2 episode over a Nitrogen era episode any day of the week. That being said, Thomas, Percy and the Coal is quite weak. Given what we know about the episodes and the stories that they were based on, I don't necessarily think it's Christopher's fault that these stories weren't as good as others. He was put under a lot of pressure to get these stories out. I've mentioned before, you cannot rush art. And if you are rushed, you will not put out your best product. And I feel like this was what happened with these stories. Christopher was pressed to write stories about certain engines to give them more screen time so that a second season could be made. If you're pigeonholed into doing something that doesn't give you the creative liberty, of course the end product isn't going to be as good. And you can tell that from some of Christopher's stories that he wrote where he wasn't under pressure compared to the ones where he was. While I prefer his stories to what was adapted to screen, I didn't mind this. It is pretty mid, and it kind of starts to set up the best friends Thomas and Percy trope that becomes the norm for following seasons. I prefer Thomas and Percy being begrudging co-workers rather than cookie-cutter best friends, because there's more dynamics to play with. There's more grey areas to explore. And the book did this a lot better than the episode did. Number 25, Better Late Than Never. Repairs on the main line viaduct are causing delays on the railway, making Thomas very cross. But he learns that there are times when being late is not such a bad thing after all. A lot of people have slated this message of being late isn't too bad. But yes, there are times where you would rather be late than not turn up. Audrey's writing style gets heavily panned from this episode. But if you read the actual book, I think that's quite unjustified. It's the way it's adapted that tends to knock it down a little bit for me, as there is a subplot that is in the books that's not translated to the screen. In Thomas, Percy and Nicole, the TV series wraps it up in a nice little bow by the end of its 4-minute episode. In the book, that arc isn't resolved until the very last story, which isn't adapted to season 2. There is an underlying tension throughout the stories, which impacts the work that is going on and impacts Thomas's mood as a result. Without that reasoning and rationale as to why Thomas is being such a he just seems like a genocidal maniac because he just wants all of the passengers to die. Especially when Henry says if they rush across the viaduct, it would collapse and you would have no passengers at all. What would you do then? Run my train on time for one thing. There's a reason why you're considered a ball bag. But I do like that we get another part of the dynamic of Thomas and Bertie's friendship. One where there is a little bit more strain, and then also the resolution at the end. Number 24, Daisy. A diesel rail car named Daisy comes to help on Thomas's branch line after Thomas's disposal and causes trouble with rude remarks towards the coaches and refusing to pull a milk tanker. There is a debate in the fandom whether Thomas and Friends is sexist. I am going to do a video on this at some point, but it is such a hot topic issue that I am holding back on it. But Daisy's character in this is the antithesis of sexist. For one, her makeup is overly caked on to make her seem a bit like a hooker. There was backlash around this at the time, which was why in later seasons, Mavis, another female diesel engine that was introduced and had quite a lot of makeup in the Railway series books, didn't have any makeup. She was toned down. Daisy was the catalyst for that. They over-sexualized Daisy as a character in this, which was weird because she wasn't in the Railway series books. It was just a normal rail car that just happened to be female. It was like they were so determined to prove that they had a girl character in this season that they doubled down on everything that made her a female representation, but it backfired tremendously. The character of Daisy is stubborn, lazy, highly sprung, but because it's overly rammed down the audience's throats that she's a girl character, it just didn't look good. The episode itself is alright. I do like the sets. I do like Daisy's design in general, bar her makeup and the resin face, but it's just not a winner for me. Number 23, Percy's predicament. Percy and Toby agree to switch jobs after Daisy refuses to take the milk again, which ends up putting the engines in an awkward predicament. This episode does do a bit better because it gives Daisy a bit of a redemption at the end, but it's only because she falls into line with everybody else. But the problem is you don't actually see the redemption. You just hear that she worked hard and gets a second chance. But that was pretty similar to the Railway series books, so it was more of an institutional problem. I did like Percy's crash, but even though Percy had a lot of spotlight episodes in this season, he took some amount of punishment as a result of it. It was like, good news Percy, we're going to give you a lot of stories. Yay! Bad news though, you're going to get in a ton of accidents. Boo! Honestly, this had the same score in my rankings as Daisy, but the crash really sold it for me. And all the sexist stereotypes of Daisy in the previous episode went against it. Number 22, Thomas and Trevor. Trevor does not have much work to do and proves to Thomas how useful he can be when he's sent to help at the harbour. I do like this episode. It gets a lot of flack. It's seen as very meandering, mundane, there's not really a purpose to it, aside from just to give Trevor another spotlight episode, which he of course shares with Thomas. But that's the point. It spotlights Trevor's good qualities. Thomas is quite frankly a racist to Trevor. He thinks because he doesn't run on rails, he's not useful. And Trevor, more than royally, puts him in his place and shows him how useful a traction engine can be. I think it's called slow and meandering because Trevor is quite slow and meandering with his work. But as I have learned with having kids, you have to teach them that you would rather they did the job slowly and got it right than do it quickly and get it wrong. And Trevor proves that. And it shows that he has a really good work ethic and doesn't just like children. Trust me, we'll get to that bit in a later entry. Number 21, Woolly Bear. Thomas thinks Percy crawls like a caterpillar due to him being late with collecting hay along the line. And when Percy ends up covered in treacle and hay, Thomas and Toby end up making jokes about him. One thing I really liked about Ghost Train and this episode Woolly Bear is Toby's character. You see how much he just doesn't give a about who is the overall winner in Thomas and Percy's little rivalry. He wants to help stir it up. He likes watching the chaos unfold all around him and just makes fun of whoever's got the raw end of the stick at that time. I like the visuals and I like Thomas and Percy's dynamic in this episode. I did think it was spiteful at first, but then when you watch later seasons, you realise that you would much prefer this spiteful, bickering version of Thomas and Percy than the best friend stereotype that gets played on in every other season after this. Number 20. Cows. Gordon and Henry tease Edward after some cows break part of his train away, but in the end, Edward has the last laugh. This episode is fine. I do like that Gordon and Henry get royally put in their place by a cow, but I've said this before and I'll say it again. I think cows would have been better if it was adapted into CGI. Obviously, I know 1986 CGI wasn't really a thing, and even if it was very, very sketchy. I'm just meaning for the Brenner era, the seasons 17 to 21. If they'd done like a flashback about this episode, it would have played out so much better in CGI, because at least we would have been able to have the cow animated and moving and maybe going up to sniff Gordon and Henry and them getting a bit freaked out, and in Henry's case, bolting. It would have had a bit more intrigue and probably been quite funny. I still think this episode is fine. Number 19, Ghost Train. Percy and Toby play a trick to scare Thomas and teach him a lesson after calling Percy a silly little engine for his ghost story. A lot of people are going to think that I am a complete bellend for putting Ghost Train close to the bottom of this list. I do like the episode. I love the visuals. I love the nighttime setting. I love the musical score from O'Donnell and Campbell in this episode. I love the directing from David Mitton. It's a visual feast, but the story itself is pretty generic. We can't lie on that. This came from the 26th book of the Railway series, and this was one of the 2 stories from that book where I felt Audrey just put them in because he had better stories to tell about Mavis and Toby. And it's the same deal when translated to the screen. The visuals more than make up for it because they're fantastic, but the story itself is just generic plod along. Let's have another episode where Thomas is in it and being a prick. Sorry guys, that's how I feel on it. It doesn't mean I don't enjoy it though. It's just not my favourite. Number 18, Thomas comes to breakfast. Thomas thinks that he can manage without his driver until he makes an unexpected visit to the station master's house one morning, making the Fat Controller very cross. It's another episode where the visuals are great, especially the crash into the house. It is fantastic, but the overall story is meh. I do really enjoy it though. I love watching Thomas be a cocky little prick and then have a massive fall from grace. It is a tale as old as Edward, and it's a winning formula. But Thomas getting in trouble for this is something that has always bothered me. It wasn't his fault. The careless cleaner meddled with his controls. That turned him into a runaway. So for him to get all the blame for this is wrong. The cleaner should be getting their arse handed to them. But it's Thomas that's getting his tender kicked, and it's not deserved. And Donald and Douglas do come off quite mean in this. Yes, they do help him get out of the station master's house. Then they just laugh at him and bugger off. And of course, the station master's wife is so sexist by today's standards. Her house has collapsed around her. She's not even sure if her kids are safe. They could have had falling rubble, plaster, bits of brick land on their heads, possibly killing her kids. And the only thing she is worried about is their breakfast. I know it's a kids show, guys, but come on. The sexism argument here is just piling up. Number 17, Wrong Road. A mix-up with Gordon and Edward ends up sending both engines on the wrong lines with their evening trains, with Gordon ending up being teased by Bill and Ben. I've said this before, but the big plot hole for me is that they establish at the start that the branch lines are important and it's not safe for big engines like Gordon to run on those lines. But he runs on that line and everything's fine. There was a setup with no payoff. I think it would have been so much more interesting to watch Gordon's journey along the branch line and find out why it's not safe for him to run on it. Is it because he is so big? Will it make the tracks unstable? Is there a risk there? No, instead we get a generic story about him winding up on a wrong road, having to sleep at the harbour. Bill and Ben threaten to dump him in the sea as a joke, and Gordon freaks out about it. Yes, it's set up so that Gordon will have more respect for Boko the Diesel, but because there were stories that weren't adapted from that book in particular, you don't know why Gordon has a dislike for Boko. You just think it's he's a Diesel, we dealt with Diesel previously, we don't like Diesels, end of. And well, yes, that is a part of it. There was more to it in the books. The episode does have brilliant nighttime visuals, and overall, if you take that plot hole out of it, it's fine. Number 16, Percy and the Signal. Percy enjoys playing tricks, but Gordon and James make a plan to pay him back. A simple yet effective story. Percy's being a cheeky git, he takes it too far. The big engines want to pay him back, they do so, job's a good one. The only thing that I still don't know about is the whole backing signal thing. Now, I get the whole point is that backing signals do not exist. They've just made this story up, it's got in Percy's smoke box, and when the signal arm moves up instead of down, he thinks this is a backing signal and starts going the wrong way. But when the driver explains what it is, we don't hear why the signal arm went up instead of down. You need to know about railway lore and railway terminology to understand that. Audrey didn't even put it in the books. You're just expected to know. I get that was Audrey's style. Don't pander to children. If they want to find out why a signal's arm moves up instead of down, they can go and find out for themselves. But when you're a kid and you just want to watch a TV show and be entertained, you do come off with questions. So, if a signal's arm moves up instead of down, what the does that mean? Number 15, Percy takes the plunge. Percy thinks that water is nothing to an engine with determination, but his mood soon changes when he passes a danger sign at the harbour. This episode has 2 appearances of main characters going forward. We have Bill and Ben, as they are the engines that Percy is regaling his story about, and then in a background shot, as Percy is coming out of the harbour, you see Diesel purring past. It's something that, if you don't know that it's there and you're not paying attention, you don't notice it. But it was such subtle foreshadowing, because in the next episode, Diesel makes his debut, and you think that was actually quite clever. He technically made his debut beforehand, in a background shot. Really loved it. These are nice little Easter eggs that you want to find as a fan. And this was done before Easter eggs were really a thing. I like the nighttime visuals of him being raised out of the water, which surprisingly, even though it's meant to have a darker tone, isn't as scary as the nighttime visuals in season 1. And just the end scene where Henry is ripping the absolute piss out of Percy, and you just see the train pulling off, and you just get to watch Percy all upset. I have to admit, even though I'm a Percy fan, I did have a giggle at that. Number 14, Thomas and the Missing Christmas Tree. Thomas is sent to collect a Christmas tree, but when he ends up getting lost along the way, Donald and Douglas set off to rescue him in time for the Christmas celebrations. I said in my season 1 video that I think we should have done the first 2 seasons Christmas episodes like this. Adapted Mrs. Kindly's Christmas from Toby's standalone book in the Railway series and had that in season 1, and then had Thomas's Christmas party in season 2. A logical amount of time would have passed, and it would make more sense. But we've got what we've got, and Thomas and the Missing Christmas Tree is a pretty solid Christmas episode. I enjoy it. I still watch it at Christmas time. I love that it gives Donald and Douglas more to do in the season. And the final scene where they're at the station and you see all of the engines that have made an appearance in this season. It's just a visual feast. A lot of people have said that because Father Christmas turns up in this, that Santa is real in this universe. I personally don't think so. What would have stopped them hiring a fat guy in a Santa outfit to come and do the exact same job? If Santa existed, why would he turn up in Harold? Why wouldn't he turn up on his magical sled with all his reindeer? Number 13, Percy and Harold. A helicopter named Harold thinks that railways are slow and out of date, but Percy proves him wrong after winning a race. The introduction of Harold the helicopter, and I love Ringo Starr's voice work for Harold in this season. It's what I adapted my own take on Harold from, and my kids love it, and it helps me get voiceover gigs as a result. So yeah, Ringo, you got me work. Nice one. But while I'm on the subject of Ringo, his voiceover work in this season was so much better than in season 1. You could tell that he'd settled into the role a bit more and he was just enjoying messing about with accents and messing about with the way that he would go about saying things. There was much less monotone and much more personality. This is why I keep saying that he shouldn't have left after season 2 to focus on his music career. I think he would have done great in season 3. There is an alternate universe out there somewhere where Ringo Starr carried on narrating Thomas for a while longer, and I would love to see what he would have done if he'd stayed on. But this episode is really good. I love the chase. A lot of people say that it's just a rip-off of Thomas and Bertie. I personally think that the template is the same, but the outcome is played so differently that it stands on its own 4 wheels. Thomas and Bertie have their dynamic, where they have their race, and they become really good friends as a result, but Percy and Harold's dynamic is totally different. They have the race, but Percy still feels inferior to Harold, and Harold still has that hoity-toity complex. So they're more best frenemies than best friends. And that is why there was so many better stories to tell with Percy and Harold in later seasons. There was more conflict to it. So it's not a rip-off of Thomas and Bertie. Thomas and Bertie was straightforward, they have a race, and then they become good friends. Percy and Harold, they have a race, there's still animosity there, but a begrudging respect that you can build on in the following seasons. Number 12, Pop Goes the Diesel. A diesel engine named Diesel arrives on trial to work with Duck and thinks that diesel engines know everything and do not need to learn, until he tries to take some old trucks from a siding. I've spoke about this episode in my top 5 episodes of the classic era that traumatized me, because this was number 1. The scene with Diesel trying to get the trucks to move and not being able to, and having a complete breakdown over it all, growling, going nuts, trucks basically being ripped apart, steam rising up, and Diesel's face just looking so angry and menacing in a close-up shot. Terror that I did not get over until just before my 21st birthday. And that shows you how good an episode this is. Like I said in season 1, these type of things are done so well that they can actually have mental scars on someone for the majority of their life. It shows you that they weren't just trying to create a show for kids. They wanted adults to be able to be interested in it as well and appreciate the craft that was going on. This is a prime example of that. It's a great story, and the first time you introduced a truly evil character in Diesel. He's smarmy, he's manipulative, but at this point he seems just like your bog standard dumb Diesel that the steam engine gets the triumph over in the end, and it's just, I'll get you back someday. But I also like the fact that Duck doesn't come off in a great light in this either. He's a bit of a bellend. Of course, you don't really have a lot of insight as to why Duck is such a bellend, because one of the episodes that gave that reasoning was not adapted from the book. But there is enough from his standalone episode previously that you can make your own assumptions around it and think why he's got a bit of an ego, because he got one over in the big engines and put them in their place. It was the great first part of a trilogy of episodes that I just think are absolutely fantastic in this season. Number 11, The Deputation. Donald and Douglas are worried that they will be sent away and scrapped, but after rescuing Henry from being snowed under, Percy and the other engines try to help the twins out with a deputation. I mentioned in the season 1 video, I love the political intrigue of stories like this. The Deputation has that. You have the engines feeling very aggrieved that the Fat Controller is going to send either Donald or Douglas away. They want to do something about it. They don't know what to do. So Percy, of course, takes the lead, speaks to Edward, he tells him what to do, and then Percy winds up being the one that has to go and present this deputation to the Fat Controller. Then you find out that he was away getting Donald and Douglas anyway, and they're both here to stay. And that end scene is fantastic. Just the chorus of cheers and whistles, and just hearing the whistles, the one line, the twins are here to stay, and then the music plays leading into the credits as you're watching the celebrations happen. And of course, the winter setting in this episode was very, very well done. I am going to do a video on why I think The Deputation is an underrated gem in Thomas and Friends, because so many people don't like it. They think it's boring and it's too dialogue heavy. I can understand that, but from my side, it is one of the best episodes of Thomas and Friends. Number 10, The Runaway. After a visit to and coming back from the works, Thomas's handbrake is very stiff, and he soon becomes a runaway on his branch line. A Christopher Audrey story that I think gets a lot of unfair stick. And I think it's down to the runaway sequence itself, which is not Christopher Audrey's fault. It's the directing side that is at fault here. For starters, they just used stock footage from Thomas's race with Bertie. in Thomas and Bertie. They could have just filmed a whole new sequence, but they decided not to. It gets a bit of slack because as Thomas becomes a runaway, Henry's train is just pulled in, and there is no shocked face from Henry that Thomas has all of a sudden become a runaway. He's still smiling. There's two reasons why I think this is actually in character for Henry. He's wanted to see Thomas get put in his place for a very long time. And watching this happening, he would naturally be like, oh, that's so bad. He wouldn't be able to help but laugh because you're like, finally, the little prick's getting what is due. The other reason I think is just because they didn't have the time to change the resting face, and it was done so much better having this just as him smiling. And there's also one little scene in this that I think is very underrated with how well it's done. As Thomas is pulling into the station and he's starting to slow down, the inspector is waiting to scramble into Thomas, screw his brake hard on and get him to stop. So the prop of the inspector is standing on the platform. Thomas comes in, and in one single take, Thomas, Annie and Clarabelle go past, and as they pass, the inspector prop is gone. Now doing that without seeing a hand coming in and lifting the inspector away and taking it away without any goof, which there was a few of in season 1, but you didn't see it this time. They had learned and they had improved, and this is a prime example of that. It's a small sequence in a 4.5-minute episode that just shows how the skill has come along in those 2 years. I like the story. I like that we get the kind of setup of Thomas not really liking Duck because he takes his coaches and they absolutely loved being out with Duck. But I do think it set the premise of new engine arrives on Sodor, they take Thomas's coaches, and Thomas isn't very happy. But for this point in time, it built up the underlying tensions between Thomas and Duck. Very well done. Number 9, the Diseasel. Saddle Tank twin engines named Bill and Ben think that a Diseasel stole their trucks of China clay and set off to find them, which makes them play tricks on a green diesel engine named Boko. Luckily, Edward is there to settle the ruckus. The introduction of Boko, one of my favourite characters. I know that a lot of people, for some reason, don't like Boko. They think he's very bland, but I don't think so. As I stated in my best characters of the classic era video, Boko reminds me of my papa, who used to look after me and my brother when we were kids. He was gentle, kind, and a great person to be around. But he also wasn't afraid to kick our asses when we needed it. And that is what Boko is to Bill and Ben. He eventually becomes this pseudo-father figure to the twins, where he'll understand their tricks and their ways, but he is also not afraid to put them in their place when they step out of line. Wrong Road is a prime example of that, because Boko comes to save Gordon, but he's sussed what Bill and Ben are up to and threatens them by taking away their trucks that he's brought for them if they don't play nice, to which they do and bog off. I just wish there was more episodes made of this dynamic of Boko, Bill, Ben and Edward. Number 8, Bertie's chase. Edward is impatient when Thomas does not show up, unaware that Bertie is taking his passengers, leading them to a chase. One thing I really noticed in this episode is how well the human props have improved since the first season. It looks like there's been a lot more care and attention to detail with the human characters in Thomas and Friends. We're not at the good stage where there is a proper range of diversity, as comes in the Hit era, but you can tell the craft and care that goes into the human characters. They don't want them as just little standy-uppy figures that just make up background fodder and you pick out as, oh, it wasn't exactly that great. There's a clear love and dedication to make this product the best it can be. As for the episode itself, I like it, but Edward's resin face of him being angry is terrifying. And I'm not meaning it in a scary, oh my god, like, this is going to haunt my nightmares way. It just looks so dodgy. Just look at all the lines around his face. I mean, that's just really, really creepy to me. He looks like a cat that is about to sneeze. I personally also think James's angry face looks a bit like a cat, but that's another story for another day. But the episode's great. It's nice that Bertie gets another role. I love the incidental music that's played throughout. I just could have done without the Thomas cameo at the end. Number 7, Saved from Scrap. Edward meets a traction engine named Trevor at the scrapyard and tries to help make him become useful again. Okay, I owe an apology off the bat here to Trevor, the traction engine. I have said in previous videos that him having a love of children can be seen in a creepy light in modern standings. I do stand by that, because if you just have it clipped as him saying, oh yes, I like children. That's creepy. But so many jokes have been made about this, and so many people have commented on this, that I feel like I have to slightly defend Trevor as well. It's not being said in the creepy connotations that we know, unless there are some Me Too allegations about Trevor the Traction Engine that I do not know about. But in the context that it's written, he wants to make them feel special. He wants them to be happy. He has fond memories of when they would come to visit him and be in awe of him. He liked the attention. He liked the adoration. That's really the main thing. I don't think it's a case of he just likes children for the sake of he's a bit creepy. I think if the adults were showing him the same kind of love and affection that the kids did in his younger days, he'd like them too. But he sees adults as kind of the enemy. If you think about it, adults have put him in the scrapyard. Adults are going to break him up. Adults are going to kill him. The kids have nothing to do with that. They love Trevor. They love to be around them. They love to see him. So he sees them as what they are. Beautiful, innocent beings that are full of love and care. And I think because I'm a parent now, I do see it in the less creepy light. Especially when you see him at the church fete, and he's got the seat bolted to his bunker, and he can give kids a ride around the orchard. I know it sounds wrong in the context of the wording, but that's him getting to relive his glory days, getting to bring smiles to children's faces and make them happy. And if that's what he lives for, if that's what he loves in the purest sense, as a parent, I can completely and 100% relate to that. You want to make your kids happy, and you want them to love you. Trevor just wants that same love. And because of what I have read into with this episode, it's why it has shot up in the rankings for me. And it's also a really solid episode for Edward. Number 6, Dirty Work. Diesel gets revenge on Duck by telling lies about the big engines to the trucks, causing the Fat Controller to send Duck away. A great episode for the completely opposite reasons of everything I have just said. This is straight up evil, conniving, manipulative, scheming Diesel at his finest. He is the antithesis of evil at this point in the franchise's history. The baddest mofo that has ever came to Sodor. I know that some channels just think of Diesel as an insignificant cockroach because he is just a mass-produced engine that will eventually take over all of steam engine kind. And I do understand that point. It is presented very well. But at this point in the franchise's history, Diesel was the first Diesel to arrive on Sodor and caused a massive show. He got the engines to turn on each other. He played on their weaknesses. He figured out the big engines don't like when trucks talk about them and make fun of them. And they especially hate it when engines are going to do that. And he's also figured out that the person that it has to be is Duck for 2 reasons. 1, because he hates him and wants him sent away. And 2, he's probably figured out that the big engines don't like Duck from their previous exploits and has known that this is the perfect opportunity to strike, play on those animosities and use it to his advantage. Thought has went into this plan. He's not just went, I want Duck sent away, I'm going to tell lies about him. He could have said lies about him to any engine in that case. But no, he's picked the 3 big engines specifically because they already have an established gripe with Duck. And that shows he's a lot more clever than the mass amounts of the fandom give him credit for. It's also an episode where the bad guy wins. At this point in the franchise's history, this has never happened. When I watched this as a kid, I had never saw episodes where the bad guys had won. This messed about with the formula because Duck got sent away. He got blamed for something he didn't do. Everybody turned on him. And the Fat Controller, even though he said he didn't believe Diesel, would have had questions and reservations given the previous. So had to send them away to keep the peace. And Diesel just thought, I've won. Great episode, fantastic storytelling, just brilliant. Number 5, Duck takes charge. A great Western engine named Duck arrives on the island to help Percy and stop the big engines from pushing smaller engines around. Speaking of the previous episode that led to Dirty Work, this is the world building that we are talking about for Thomas and Friends. Not just in the sense of that we're establishing new characters, not in the sense that we are establishing new locations, because they talk about the new harbour that Percy is going to help Thomas and Toby with. We get Duck arriving. He instantly causes a massive storm because the big engines think, let's mess with him, and Duck goes, haha, bring it, and gets them put in their place. And with the egos of Gordon, James, and Henry at this time, you know that they feckin' hated that a little engine got one over on them. All three of them in one fell swoop. And also got Percy in on it as well, because they'd just got one over on him from Percy and the Signal previously. So not only has Duck totally owned their asses, but he's done it with the engine that they thought they finally got one up on, planting all these seeds for future episodes and future storylines. It was something that Audrey was fantastic at doing. It's why I say that he was a great writer and not a writer of children's fiction. He knew story. He knew how to world build. He was a serialized storyteller. That's what made him fantastic. Number 4, Old Iron. James is fed up with Edward for being so slow, but when two boys fiddle with James's controls, Edward comes to his rescue. Okay, let's just forget the fact that it says two boys fiddle with James's controls. That sounds wrong by modern day standards. Because aside from that, this episode is phenomenal. This showed how much they were planning on upping their game. This entire chase sequence, the way that it's filmed, the different camera angles that are used that weren't able to be used in season 1 because of the space limitations, the storytelling that was on display, the incidental music used, is an episode that you can watch as an adult and still feel that same sense of suspense and fear that you did as a kid. This is what made Thomas and Friends so unique. It was something that you could watch as an adult and really, really appreciate it. The cinematography from 1986 still holds up in modern day. There are plenty of filmmakers out there that could learn so much from watching the early seasons of Thomas and Friends, but they write it off as a stupid kids show. It was not. I would not have a channel devoted to this if it was a simple baby TV show. It would be added to the scrap heap of TV shows that I watched as a kid and never went back to. And it's why season 2 holds such a special place in my heart. It's episodes like this. Number 3, Brake Van. Twin engines named Donald and Douglas are bought by the Fat Controller. Things do not go well for the twins due to a spiteful brake van. The official introduction of Donald and Douglas. Missing coach aside. What a brilliant episode. Ringo Starr trying to do a Scottish accent is bloody hilarious. It's so bad, but it is so good at the same time. One thing that I want any normies to take away from this video. Go on YouTube and find the episode Brake Van and Ringo Starr's narration. Him doing a Scottish accent, I say very, very loosely, it's something that puts a smile on your face. Because he knows that it's bad, but he doesn't care. He flings himself into it and has fun with it. The scene where the brake van is just totally crushed to smithereens, it's probably the only time in my life I've ever condoned murder. Because that's straight up what it is. He murders this brake van. The crash sequence of Donald slipping and going straight into the signal box was very, very well executed. The only thing that I did have an issue with, and I have mentioned this in my Missing Coach video, is that without the 2 previous stories, you just think the Fat Controller has a grudge against Douglas for no reason. But I thoroughly enjoyed it. It's great seeing 2 Scottish engines get a lead role. The incidental music that Michael Donald done for Donald and Douglas, it's still something that I love listening to. It's just great. Number 2, A Close Shave. Duck helps with some trucks on Gordon's Hill, but the train breaks away and the trucks chase him down the main line until he ends up in a barber shop at Crosby. The final part of the Duck and Diesel trilogy. And it's the one that really cements your love for Duck the Great Western Engine. This is where you see the true colours of Duck. He will put his own life and his own safety at risk to make sure that others are not hurt. The chase sequence between the trucks and Duck is great. I do like how they try and implement the plan to slow down the trucks. It's just a bit too late for how it's going because they don't realise that James's train is right in front of them and they're basically going to crash into it. And then the crash into the barbershop, brilliant. I mentioned this before, but the only thing that I have the problem with is that at the end, the Fat Controller just says, you know, I didn't believe Diesel. I sent him packing. We never find out why he sent him packing. You do find out in the Railway Series book. Diesel started telling lies about Henry, and that's what rumbled him. But even in the book, it's just one line of dialogue. That's something that I would have loved to have seen more of. what Diesel got up to while Duck was helping Edward. Why did he all of a sudden turn on Henry? He had everything he wanted. He got his nemesis away, and the big engines were firmly on his side. So why did he turn? Would have been something really, really unique to explore. And the number one episode of Thomas and Friends, Season 2, is Edward's exploit. Gordon and James think Edward should give up and be preserved, but Edward proves just how useful he is when he takes the visitors home during a storm. Every Thomas fan watching this list would know that Edward's exploit would be number one. Sometimes I like to throw you a curveball, but I just can't in this case. It's Edward's spotlight episode. It shows the true nature of his character. It's fantastic. I will say that I think the episode would have been better if it was done in CGI during the Brenner era, because it could have really shown you how dire the situation was for Edward. The episode is great. It's not number one for no reason. But because of the model making things at the time and how much they couldn't risk damaging them, the only thing you really notice is that Edward's sidewads have had to come off. In the books, you see how bad the injury is to Edward. It's essentially if someone got in an accident and lost the use of their legs. It's pretty much the same deal as what happens to Edward in this. It's scrap worthy, yet he does not quit. He does not give up. When he thinks his wheels can't make another turn, they make another turn until he gets his passengers home. Yes, they are very late, but the fact they get home in the first place is something that no one expected. Edward was compared to Captain America in the sense that he does not give up. It's an Americanized way of looking at it, but it's very, very apt. And it puts everybody in their place. And it's how everybody should have continued to look at Edward in every season going forward. If we were able to bury the Thomas and Gordon rivalry from season 1 and have that stick throughout the entirety of the franchise, we should have been able to have it stick that Edward had won the respect of his peers, and we didn't need to worry about poor, frail Edward who needs to give up and be preserved. And I think that's why so many people hate what happened to Edward as a character in Following Eras. He done more than enough to prove himself. And that is my ranking video of Thomas and Friends Season 2. What are your thoughts on Season 2? Do you agree with any of the points I've made? How would you rank the episodes? But most importantly, thank you so much for watching. And until next time, keep on chugging.